Thanks very much, and yeah, my sincere apologies for having to run off time to get back, and I really appreciate the opportunity. It's a great honor. This is just a magnificent conference that Marlene and the center here put on every year. Just delighted to be part of it, and this also very distinguished panel. So, the bulk of this presentation draws upon some previous research, some current research. In the book I'm writing with John Heathershaw about Central Asia's global networks and connections, and we're trying to sort of look at the very hidden links that Central Asia has to different legal and financial structures in the global economy, and so OBOR is part of that chapter in that book. So the announcement of OBOR, actually fittingly enough, happens at Nazarbayev University in September 2013. A lot of different things written about it. One of the most hyped quotes here from the South China Morning Post. This is the most significant far-reaching project the nation has ever put forward. It's comprised of both a land belt as well as a maritime belt, sort of port upgrades, links between Europe and East Asia, Middle East, South Asia, and Eurasia, so all in this sort of service of connectivity. There's also the formation of new regional financing institutions, AIIB, a new Silk Route Fund, which is actually under the auspices of the People's Bank, like a fund being under the auspices of the central bank, new development game, and all in an effort to fill in Asia's $8 trillion infrastructure gap. So we hear a lot about the U.S. New Silk Route and the Chinese one. What are the differences? I think they're pretty stark. China is actually committing hundreds of billions of dollars. U.S. not much, if any. China is establishing new regional funding vehicles. The U.S. is actually kind of claiming existing projects like TAPI, and in some ways I think unnecessarily geopoliticizing them. And just for me, the Chinese OBOR signals sort of China rising and future engagement, lasting engagement in the region, whereas the new Silk Road for the U.S. is sort of associated with its legacy and regional withdrawal. There's just some of the new global lenders out there. The countries signing up to the AIIB. Actually, interestingly enough, there's a mix of Central Asian countries signed up to the AIIB, so Kyrgyzstan has not. Some of the others have. So here are some visuals of Silk Route, the economic belt. And the thing to think, really to emphasize here, is that the hub of some of these proposed northern corridors, central corridors, southern corridors, they pass through a significant part of Xinjiang and Central Asia, right? And so the different routes plow through the West in different configurations. Some include China's new Central Asia pipelines, oil pipeline in Kazakhstan, the energy pipeline, gas pipeline is part of it. And here's the consolidated map that you see cited and used a lot from the Wall Street Journal that includes both the pipeline routes and the maritime and overland routes. Okay, so then what are the drivers? I think we can separate these out into sort of geopolitical and domestic. A lot of emphasis on the geopolitical, the idea of binding regions and states to China, creating a China-oriented community. Some talk about the need to put accumulated foreign reserves better used in idle investments, internationalization of the currency, and the kind of Xi Jinping doctrine sort of formalized China's arrival as a leading power in global governance, rulemaking, and agenda setting, right? But there's also important domestic ones that don't get as much attention, right? One is the Xinjiang issue, the need to maintain Xinjiang as a hub, the equation that infrastructure investment and development will equal political stability, both in Xinjiang and Xinjiang's neighbors. The more connected Xinjiang is, the more economic opportunity Xinjiang has, the more less likelihood you'll see sort of flare-ups of sort of separatism and bouts there. Slowing Chinese growth rates and domestic overcapacity, right? This is a huge issue now. As we get to the world of 6% growth as opposed to 11% growth, we see cement, steel, large overcapacity. Where's the surplus going to go? It's going to go into some of these projects. As well as you see competition amongst individual Chinese regions to be nodes in these new hubs, to the point where some regions sent negotiators, right, to talk about some of these sort of routes and so forth. So there's sort of a kind of a mirror here of kind of the East Chinese Sea coastal cities, rather sort of competing. So there's a lot of domestic drivers. Just two that I flagged here. One, the Suzhou Construction Machinery Group just announced that over the last 2 years, as economic slowdown has been happening in China itself, it has been ramping up its operations in Central Asia, an estimate about $490 million worth of contracts and investments that it plans to make in the region. UnionPay, provider payment systems in China, is targeting the Kazakh and Central Asian market for use its product to be an alternative to Western-based and local payment systems. So there's a lot of different kinds of domestic interests, and they're not all necessarily sort of in infrastructure building, but the perception is that the Central Asian market can pick up the slack of the downturn in China. And then, of course, the overriding point in Xinjiang is to avoid instability or chaos. So I actually want to get into some of the problems that I see with the OBOR, hence the kind of cheeky title that I have, One Belt, One Road, Many Headaches, because I think these don't get enough play as we look at sort of China's aspirations in the region. And so the first question I ask is, a lot of OBOR is premised on the idea of building hardware, right? But the question is development a hardware problem or is it a software problem, right? Is it about the physical infrastructure that you need and the investments, or is it about how that investment is used and what types of links are made in domestic contexts? So I'm going to flag a few challenges. The first is sort of the governance challenges, and here I actually disaggregate them into 3 different issues that I see and potential dangers. You're talking about a region, right, obviously, where corruption and governance is inherently problematic. So how will this anticipated Chinese investment play out? Well, one is there is the likelihood or danger that local lead government agencies privatize the revenue sources that come in from China, very similar to what happened in Tajikistan with the Dushanbe-Chenak highway, where sort of toll booths that were linked to a company registered offshore were sort of put up, right? So then actually the infrastructure is not open and accessible to the public, right? It's a rent-making revenue scheme for local elites. Second possibility is the displacement of rent seeking, right? So that you create 2 tiers. Containers or cargoes that operate with clearances on the one hand, but then customs officials have to make up for that and get their sort of informal revenues from other sources. And I think something similar happened with the anti-yen shipments, if you want sort of a predecessor here. And then third is the potential ratcheting for graft. So China's money dump raises the cost to other regional investors, demands for side payments and private goods. So I think these are 3 different types of governance issues that possibly could emerge. Talk about the Tajik case. This is a chart I use in almost all presentations here, so why not put it up here? This is the problem Central Asia's informal trade barriers, data from ease of doing business. These are import-export times. 2006, 2014 hasn't gotten a whole heck of a lot better, except export times in Uzbekistan have gotten marginally better. So it takes, from this chart, 104 days to import to have something clear in Uzbekistan, 83 in Tajikistan, 75 in Kyrgyzstan, 76. So how is that comparatively in the world? It's really high. Right? If you were to pick a region in the world where you want to build the new Silk Route, I would say from scratch, Central Asia would not be it. Right? So Central Asia, in terms of informal barriers to trade, 3 times as big as the Middle East and North Africa, double what they are in South Asia. This is really one of the most trade unfriendly regions in the world. Internally, there's reasons for that, and we can take questions on that. A second problem that I see, will this infrastructure development and large flows of capital in the region, will they promote political stability or actually exacerbate regional tensions and conflicts, right? And the assumption here is that investment leads to stability and cooperation, but the question is why? Why is that assumption operating? In fact, you can make an argument from a micro level that in places where you have ethnic tensions or even a state of sort of low intensity conflict, that an influx of capital and big development projects actually can exacerbate regional antagonisms. We've seen examples of this: Baluchistan, Pakistan, northern Myanmar. There's tension surrounding the southern Kyrgyz-Uzbek railway corridor, as well as within Xinjiang itself. And I think when these issues sort of come up, the Chinese government tends to blame the messenger, right? In a lot of these cases, sort of Western NGOs that might highlight some of these problems and issues. But this is an overall, I think, sort of structural problem they're going to have to contend with. The Pakistan vector, sort of $46 billion committed to energy and infrastructure projects. So I just ask the sort of counterfactual here: if the U.S. were to announce tomorrow it was dumping $46 billion into road and energy plant construction projects in Pakistan, what would the reaction be here? I think there would be concerns about local politics, about that. Three, what are the geopolitical frictions and rivalries? We know the ones between Japan and China, and of course the U.S., I think, kind of ham-fisted opposition of the AIIB. Possible second-order effects, exacerbating tensions between India and Pakistan. The most interesting one, though, is I think this relationship with Russia, right? What is the relationship between OBOR and the EEU? And I think, you know, the sort of emphasis now on the coordination meetings going on in Moscow and Beijing, to me, misses the greater point. Yes, there will be difficult negotiations that they agree on common projects and what China should fund. There will be an overall framework where China decides to recognize the EEU as a legitimate partner. But all this is going to be playing catch-up to dynamics on the ground. And if you accept the premise that I do, that it's domestic actors that are pushing a lot of these inroads, then even if there are general macro framework agreements between Russia and China over what China is and is not going to do, it's going to be very difficult to get a handle on that on the ground. At the very heart, and this is just my opinion, the EU and OBOR are actually conceptually incompatible, right? The EEU is about fencing in economic activity as a regional economic bloc. OBOR is about transit and connectivity. And so how you marry those at the micro level doesn't really matter in terms of this big picture kind of tension between the two. They're very different visions. Issue 4, how does China cope with debt as a result of all this investment and lending, right? So what does China do around the world? Well, in some places it just forgives debt, right? In Africa we've had a few bouts of debt cancellation, but they're quite small sums. And sometimes it's conditioned a little bit to the one China policy. But I think the question becomes, as any lender would, if you restructure the debt, then what are the terms of that restructuring? And just to give you a sense of the magnitude here, from the FT article, we're starting to deal with real sums of money. It's one thing to talk about a few $100 million here, a couple of billion there. But when we look at this initial tranche, most of these energy for loans deals concluded during a great financial crisis in 2009. What do we have? We have Venezuela at 55 billion, Ecuador at 5, Argentina at 19. In the Central Asian context, 8 to Turkmenistan, 13 billion to Kazakhstan. We're starting to talk about some serious money. Now, yes, there's the possibility that all of this might be written off or that it's not important, but I think in the context of slumping economic development, something else has to be planned. So do you demand more equity or more stuff in kind? Do you stretch out the nature of the relationship? Sort of what happens between China and these debtors? Is there a foreign policy quid? Is, I think, a matter of real interest. And then finally, I think the thing we need to acknowledge about OBOR, and this is why I dislike, and I apologize because I know it's standard framing, this talk of connectivity, is that Central Asia is already connected. There is already connectivity between Central Asia and the US, between the Central Asia and China. There are global networks. There are ways in which deals get done. There are deals between SOEs and local elites. And my question is, does OBOR create new types of connectivity, or just does it feed these existing networks? Just a reminder that there's a massive oil industry-related anti-corruption purge going on right now in China. The two of the highest officials implicated were involved in overseeing major operations in Kazakhstan and in Turkmenistan. That what's emerged so far from the investigation is sort of, one is a lot of unsupervised, unmonitored activity as these oil companies sort of expanded abroad, and two, a lot of offshore leaks, in a good offshore leak site, A lot of these execs sort of setting up their own kind of funding vehicles as well as sort of their own personal accounts. There's an example of this. I don't have time to get into it. It's the CNPC Aktobe Monet gas. This was originally alleged by Ablyasov, but the Wall Street Journal ran a big sort of expose on this. You know, how Chinese companies, and they're not the only ones, tend to use offshore vehicles to structure deals in the region. In this particular case, created Darley Investment Services to purchase CIFF, which then repurchased the stake in Aktobe, which yielded $166 million alleged side payment to members of the company. So, so connectivity, yes, but there's already connectivity. It's just we don't like talking about it. It's the connectivity that's embedded in global structures, offshore registries, intermediate brokers, all which create these sorts of webs of global ties and links. So I agree that OBOR remains a significant project, certainly a lot more significant than the US version of this. And if realized, it offers significant opportunities, but it also poses a lot of unacknowledged, I would say, risks and wildcards that I think we're only now starting to appreciate and understand on the economic front, the political, the social front. And sort of where I get to this in terms of practical policy is, do all these different risks now that that Beijing has to cope with in an arena like Central Asia, does it lead to a de facto, because I don't think it's ever going to be announced, change in the non-interference doctrine? Right? Do you need closer monitoring on the ground to ensure that a lot of these political and economic tensions don't percolate up? Or do you just let all of this stuff go, right? And just sort of ride with this and some policy recommendations about informed engagement, sustained inputs, and maintaining a flexibility of response. I think the key to dealing with OBOR is having regional knowledge and expertise. It's understanding that a project in Myanmar may not play out the same way in southern Kyrgyzstan, may not play out the same way in Pakistan, right? And understanding that local environment as opposed to sort of accepting it all as a good thing or all as a bad thing. And I'll take it there. Maybe you have a question.